Okay, you should be able to go now.
All right, I'll get started. What I'm not going to talk a whole lot about what our project here at MSU was about. I'm looking at it from a overview sort of thing, except what I was there for. I'll talk a little bit about that. But I'll show a number of slides that I took while I was there, pictures, which kind of indicate the conditions under which they operate. And so with that introduction, I think I'll just get started and start going through my slides. Marion and I, how I became involved, we moved to Las Cruces in 2008, and I knew Lowell Catlett, Dean of Agriculture here at NMSU. And while with the World Bank, I'd known him. And anyway, he arranged for me here to teach here at the college. And in 2009, the Ag College that he heads up, they signed a contract with USAID to improve the management on land and water resources in Afghanistan. And irrigation engineering specialists at the university were involved in that. And due to my experience in rural development at the World Bank, I was asked to help. And then I spent about 8 months there at 4 different times, about each time about 2 months in length. And anyway, that's kind of how I got involved in the arrangement that the university had with USAID in Afghanistan. And so let me go to the next slide. Here's some books that I read in preparation. These are kind of interesting books. Some of you probably were aware of. 3 Cups of Tea by Greg Mordison. Caravans by James Menchner. That was a very interesting book. How people had traveled by camels and different things. And of course, you must remember Charlie Wilson's war. He was the one that interceded and got the US involved with the folks in Afghanistan that wanted to get rid of the Russians. And then the Kite Runner, and then Descent into Chaos. Anyway, it's those references kind of give you a background as to why Afghanistan is the way it is. This is Afghanistan is landlocked, and right in the middle of you got the 3 stands up on top: Turkestan, Uzbekistan. By the way, they're all Muslim countries in the north, and then it goes off to the right there. Just a little sliver actually connects with China. Kind of interesting. And then, of course, Pakistan to the right. And on the other side of them is India, of course. And then Iran to the west. So it's landlocked and doesn't have convenient access to the ocean. Anyway, that's kind of where it is. Okay, this is a picture of the Himalayas. And when I came out of Kabul one time, I had a chance to take this picture. It went north, and rather dramatic scene of the Himalayas, just northeast of Afghanistan, and rather dramatic. So recent history, stats. In the 80s, of course, the Soviet invasion and exit. Then the 90s, Civil War, Taliban control. And then in the early 21st century, American and NATO came in. Population, 40 million, doubled since 1980, imagine that. Western countries, in fact, Russia, US, Japan, we're not even keeping our population. And the only reason that the US has a decent economy really is because of immigration, which is a double-edged sword from according to some people. Anyway, the reason that's population has grown so much is that recently 5.5 children born per woman in Afghanistan. The per capita GDP isn't very much. It's $540. Just to give a comparison, in the US, it's the average per capita GDP, and that's what this is, it's about 55,000. And I said, well, that's not right. Anyway, that's the average. But if you take the medium, it's only 25,000. In other words, if you take the medium, half is below and half is above, which indicates, and the reason that is so different is because of the total inequality we have in our economy. Anyway, labor force, primarily agriculture, industry and services are, now that was when I was there in 2009 and 10. And it's changed now because, quite frankly, a lot of money has come into Afghanistan over the years. And the industry has increased, doubled, and services also. So it's about 50%, a little under 40% now. And unemployment when we were there was rather high, and inflation, but now it's not near as bad as it was then. At least I'm talking before the recent change in governance there. That just gives you a little indication of what the situation is from a statistics standpoint in Afghanistan. My assignment was to the World Bank had a very successful project in China back in 94 and 2005, and it's similar conditions in Afghanistan so far as the watersheds are concerned. And in Afghanistan, as in China back in the 90s, at the area that we had this rehabilitation project, were very unproductive. And so to make that, they asked me to see if we could make a connection with that and apply it to Afghanistan. And in the following slides, I'll discuss this a little bit. So here's a watershed is like we have the Mississippi, which is a huge watershed, but off of the Mississippi are the Rio Grande, are smaller watersheds. And so this is a typical watershed, just showing how it's higher in some places and coming down, and percolation and groundwater and all that sort of stuff. So the China Loess Plateau, that was the rehabilitation project that the World Bank had in China. And this is back before China became extremely much more productive than it was back then. And it was still early on in the early 90s, it was still primarily a communist country. And then after that, it became kind of a government-sponsored capitalist country, kind of a state-sponsored capitalist country. And anyway, the objectives were to help the rural poor install sustainable water conservation practice, and then we and others were involved, but the World Bank was the leader. Anyway, project terraces, irrigation, reservoirs, establishment of trees, grass, so forth and so on. It was a major project. Actually, the area that they worked in was about as big as France. And so it was a huge project. There were about 2,000 villages there that were involved. Anyway, this is what it looked like before the project was implemented. It had been misused. The resources, land and water resources, had been misused for thousands and thousands of years. And although the soil was pretty deep, it was very unproductive. Anyway, here's what it looked after the project. As you can see, a lot of terraces. They had planted trees. In the project, one of the things they wanted to do is to get the locals involved. And so they did a lot of the work themselves. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. But as you can see, this is a much more productive area than the previous picture. And here's the result of that project and the tremendous reduction in poverty. That's the first slide on the left. And increase in production, almost double, not quite. And then tremendous increase in income per capita. And so, and it actually, this was this wasn't when it was completed. This was towards the end of the project, but it was very successful. So why was it successful? And this, participatory, there was everybody involved, and early wins so that people could see something was happening. Security of land tenure was a very important topic because this is just the shift in China from community-owned or state-owned farms and this sort of thing. And one of the things the bank insisted on was they had to give some land tenure to the people that lived there. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the incentive to work on that unless they got the benefits. They didn't want it to go to the state. They wanted it to go to themselves. And that was a very important, one of the more important aspects is why it was successful. And a strong political will at all levels, wide practical procurement and so forth. But the security of land tenure for the people that lived there was one of the really critical reasons why it was successful. This is this is a picture I took in Afghanistan. And it just shows the barren landscape. And you can see over on the right, there's a couple of men sitting there having tea, which is very typical, taking care of those cattle. And, but that's a typical view of when I was there in 2010. And they had just like in China, they had misused their land and water resources unbelievably. And so one of the objectives of development there for us and others was to make that productive rather than unproductive. So I'm going to go through these real quick. There's observation followed in Afghanistan. I took most of these pictures myself. This is the Kabul airport, which we flew in and out many times. And this is an abandoned village. When the Taliban came in, when the Taliban and Russians came in and so forth, there was tremendous exit of people. In fact, 50% of the people either went to Pakistan or Iran. And there was just an unbelievable exit. And this is abandoned terraces. And what's a very typical scene is livestock running around in urban areas to the chagrin of people that live there. And here is people harvesting grain. Can you imagine? They're just harvesting this and putting it in piles and then taking it somewhere else to get the grain out. Extremely inefficient, extremely inefficient. Whereas in our country, we have these huge combines that do the work. And that's why they have such a large part of their population in agriculture. This is a young boy that had picked up wheat straw, which they used to feed their cattle in the wintertime. Not very nutritious food for cattle. And but it just shows how backward they are, quite frankly. Now, this is Kuchi Herders. These are nomads. They go around the country, and the people that have that farm and have crops and so forth, they get very disturbed with them because they go around just like nomads. Now, they've been reduced considerably, but it just kind of indicates that still occurs in a country this day and age. These are fuel paddies that they, in the wintertime, rather than reintroducing back into the soil to increase the nutrition of the soil, they use this keep warm in the wintertime. Can you just imagine what that smells like in a home? I can't. Anyway, here's the Tangier River coming down from the Himalayas. That we have people that come there, plus the project that I was involved in. They've done a fair amount in helping them control their water and their irrigation systems, but historically they haven't done very well. Abandoned Soviet tanks. You can see some ladies there sitting next to it, and over time they have the locals have taken off parts and so forth and done what they wanted with them. And this was typical along the roadside. This is in Kabul. I actually took this picture, and people in their burqas getting across the street. I can't imagine it was very safe. I'm sure a number of them got hit by cars. Anyway, that was typical when we were there in Kabul. Here's young girls going to school. Here's an Afghan taxi, which is very typical there. They would have 4 or 5 people in these motorcycle taxis, very common on the streets. AMRACs, these are American troops primarily in the countryside. You didn't dare get close to them on the road because they wouldn't want you to. And so also with the natives, that was true also. And this was an Afghan wedding that some of us had gone to. And a young man on the right side, he was the groom. But of course, in an Afghan wedding, there's no connection between the women and the men. And you can see in that left picture that the men are dancing together. The women and men don't interact in these kind of social situations. And the fellow on the right, he was in our compound, and he's the father of in fact, that young man, at the time, he was going to a school in the US, a college. Anyway, here's in picture I took in Kabul, just outside of Kabul. Not unusual for contractors would come over and do a road or a school, and then when they got done, they would just park them in a yard, and it would be too much expense to bring them back. So they basically would allow the Afghans, but the Afghans didn't know how to operate them and didn't have the money to operate them. And so they just sat in these yards and eventually just became a big junk pile. Here's, you can see on the right, I'm sitting with, I believe, a Pakistan scientist and some farmers figuring out how they should manage that particular piece of land. And also with the large group of people, I was sitting, talking to them and really giving them a lecture of, wouldn't you rather have green countryside rather than brown countryside, and they said, we want the green. Anyway, those are primarily farmers in that one. This is a site where an IED was blown off towards Jalalabad. So bad things were happening. Anyway, that's just a real quick observations of what Afghanistan looked like when we were there in 2009 and 10. And the next few slides, I'm just going to talk about some of the progress report I made in 2010. And I'm leading up to what I'll really be the main point of this topic. This is actually what I said in 2010. Military success, very difficult. Bad guys merge easily into the villages and countryside. In other words, as soon as the Americans come in, boom, they're just into the, they don't want the Taliban and back in power, but also they want the Americans gone. That's a real dilemma. And so the Afghans in our compound, we had our group had a separate house, separate from the embassy, about, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles away in Kabul. And we were totally separate from the embassy. And we had Afghan guards and Afghan drivers. And in our compound, we had probably only about 4 or 5 Americans there. And the scientists, other scientists were from Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so it was a real mixture of us and locals. Guards in the US Embassy, UN and USA, they had imported Asians. So far as guards. And so rather than Afghans, that didn't signal much faith in the Afghans. And the people we interacted with in the compound and elsewhere, there just wasn't much confidence in the Karzai government. Quite frankly, the way they felt, in other words, they felt, the people we interacted with felt the Taliban's the lesser of two evils. So that's kind of the way they felt. Now, these were other issues that I didn't report in 2010, but was present. Whenever civilian personnel left the US Embassy, they were accommodated by military police. In fact, when the people that we work with in USAID, when they came over to our compound, they had military people with them. And high-level US military and civilian officials interacted with Afghan government personnel, which they sponsored, but very seldom with everyday Afghans. And so they did, you know, when you hear them on TV here recently talking about what the situation was, they never really got down and interacted directly with everyday Afghans. And about 50% of the Americans in Afghanistan were contractors. And that, you know, they did most of the work so far as improving roads and schools and other things. And so that was, when we flew in there on a plane, it was full of contractors. It was back and forth. In other words, there was little interaction between Afghans and Americans in Afghanistan. It's like they lived on two different planets. Development success, more likely. This is back to what I reported when I was there in 2010. Afghan was just devastated after the Civil War and into the 90s with the Taliban and so forth. And they moved to either Pakistan or Iran, as I indicated earlier. Most moved back when we were there, and but it was a long way to go. I would equate it to the South after our Civil War. Hardworking people who only wanted good for themselves and their families, and there's no question they needed development help. No question about that. And including our group, there was a lot of people involved. The World Bank had a presence there, Asian Development Bank, US Aid, which has supported us. There was a rehabilitated of nearly 1 million hectares of irrigation systems, through sea sources, food processing, pests, and so all this the good stuff was going on in development. I sure hope now that the Taliban has taken over that will still be the case. And so there was a lot of people involved in trying to help Afghanistan become a modern country. Now I'm coming up to what the situation was in 2020. Taliban controls 60 to 70% of Afghanistan. Over time, like some people have said, you may have the military, you may have the resources, but we have time. And so eventually, they, through persistence and having the same religious beliefs as other people, especially rural, uneducated systems, more concerned with religion than economic development. And American installed Afghan government corrupt and more interested in their enrichment and survival than for the good of the country. And quite frankly, the Trump administration and candidate Biden, when they were running for office back in 2020, everybody knew the Taliban was going to take over. It was just a matter of time. Unless we put a whole new bunch of military in there in which the country wouldn't have accepted, it was just a matter of time. It wasn't going to change. Opium production in Afghanistan, still, when we were there and then even more later, it was huge. It is huge. They provide about 80 to 90% of the opium for Europe and elsewhere. And the Taliban, that's one way they got a lot of their resources, about $4 billion a year from opium production. And also in when the people travel in parts of Afghanistan, they collect duties from them. And they have their own ways of getting money. And so that's how they do it. So anyway, I think the next slide is my conclusion. Then we'll have a discussion. Libya next kind of would have occurred, been chaotic if Trump was president or any other earlier president. It wouldn't have made a whole lot of difference what was going to happen. And military action in the Middle East, and not just Afghanistan, but Iraq and anywhere, will never be successful if done by Western Christian infidels, just like the Crusades. They must solve their own problems, Sunni versus Shiite. That, and among Islam countries, that goes back centuries, and they still fight each other. In Afghanistan, it was primarily a Sunni country, about 90% Sunni and 10% Shiite. But in countries like Iran, yeah, and or some others, I forgot exactly, it's primarily Shiite, but they have had a long-term conflict, just like back in 15th, 16th century Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants, but they still have it. They believe in the religious purity more important than economic development. I forget one time I was giving a speech in Kabul to some of the folks there, and I indicated that how can you expect to have economic progress if half your country is not allowed to work like others? And when I meant half, I meant women weren't allowed. And I got some sour faces, I can tell you. I didn't say it again. Also, treating women fairly. They have to solve these problems themselves. We can't impose our beliefs on them. And they have to determine, do they want to play in the world community, be an adversary or a partner? And from our standpoint, diplomacy and constant vigilance should be our approach. Not going in with our military and think that we can change what they're doing. So anyway, that's a quick summary of what I observed. And so how do I switch off of this, Sarah? Can we go back to a group situation? Sarah, are you there?
We haven't.
Go ahead and take it off for you.
Okay, will you take it off? There you
go.
All right. So questions, comments?
Yeah, what about land ownership actually in Afghanistan, Paul? You
Well,
mentioned in China, that was sort of a big deal.
Yeah, and you see, it's not, most of the poor people that are there, it's a community type thing. In other words, you have tribal ownership of things and not individual ownership of land. And if you're powerful and you're connected to the people, a tribal leader, whatever the case might be, you're not too bad off. But in general, if you're just leasing the land or whatever the case might be, you don't have much influence. And there's not a lot of incentive, just like I said in China, that they had it was a communist country, and then they changed the idea where they didn't have long-term ownership, but they had long-term arrangements, which allowed the locals to feel that they would get something out of it if they improved the land. And so anyway, it's just not real good. The land tenure situation is, for the average Afghan out in rural areas, is very tenuous.
Thank
I'd like
you.
to thank you very much, Paul, for an excellent
Oh,
presentation.
this is it. There you are, Roger. I didn't know if you were there.
This is John Bloom speaking.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I watched from a viewpoint that nobody else has, I'm sure. My wife's younger sister dedicated her life to international nursing. She was stationed in Kabul, and we were encouraged to come and visit her. And we did. And we were fascinated by the visit. We had a couple of weeks there, and my wife put in for a Fulbright fellowship, professorship, and she got it and spent about a year in Afghanistan and Kabul. We had, in other words, a number of visits there, and my wife spent almost a year there.
Oh.
The horrible story from a struggling country to a disastrous country is illustrated so much by your statistics, and of course the key is the Russian invasion of 1970s.
Yeah.
The Afghans fled. Then we helped some refugees coming to the United States, had living with us a woman who had been the head of the Girl Guides of Afghanistan when my wife had been teaching there and getting acquainted with everything. Anyway, thank you. One of the aspects of the tragedy is the continuation of exercise of authority over Afghanistan by Pakistan particularly,
Yeah,
Iran to the extent that they wish that they could. And Afghanistan has been a tool of diplomacy and all kinds of controversies between Russia, India, Pakistan, Iran, poor, suffering Afghanistan.
yeah. Afghanistan is kind of in the middle. And not a good middle. Yeah. I wanted to follow up on something in regard to the one reason I was there was try to convince I didn't follow up on that when I went through it, try to convince the Afghans to do the similar thing that the World Bank had done in China. And I had made several presentations to government ministers about that. And in fact, I had an agreement from the World Bank and others and China that we would send a delegation up there and they would be very acceptable to show how they did it and what was important. But they really never showed a real strong interest. They just thought that, well, that's a nice thing to do, but I don't think they were really concerned with that, with their Afghan country citizens. Anyone else, please? Go ahead,
Charlie,
Charlie.
you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted. Yeah, you're muted. There you go.
Okay, how about that? For some reason on this machine, the space bar doesn't unmute, but anyway, what I wanted to ask you, that watershed in China that you worked on, and you got the agreement for the land tenure, does that survive to date?
Oh, yes, yeah. Yeah, it's and in fact, the World Bank wouldn't have done it. That was that and other conditions they set in place before they would even consider the project. And then of course, as you remember, that was kind of in the transition where they went from a total communist country to kind of a state-sponsored capitalism. And but in the rural areas, in this particular area, they allowed them to have long-term, and then they could pass it on to their families. Tenure wouldn't be ownership like in our country, where but it was. They had the locals had the feeling that they could continue to own, and it's still there. It's still that way. Yes.
Okay, so is it pretty much? How am I trying to say? Whenever World Bank makes those kind of agreements, normally they pretty much last.
Well, yeah, in this case they did, and that there was a project I remember we had in the Philippines where we had a total agreement, and it didn't last. But there it did. And but no, that one of the more successful rural development projects that the World Bank had, quite frankly. So anybody else?
Building on Charlie's question, was there any effort in Afghanistan made to implement a similar policy, and it was just
well,
simply
and that's
like
what
this
I said
started?
earlier. I had lectured to government ministries about what that success was, and we would be willing to pay for a delegation to go up to China, and then the World Bank would be there and so forth. They just weren't interested. They had quite frankly, they had their arrangement with the U.S. State Department and so forth, and they were doing well. And I just don't think they had I tried to convince them to go up, but they wouldn't go. They just didn't, they weren't interested in really improving the well-being of rural Afghanistan.
Right.
Just the bottom line.
Mhm.
Yeah, Jane.
You know, I have to wonder too, if the government felt that it was impractical, since the Taliban has, throughout all of this engagement with Russia, the US and so forth, continued to control so much of the country.
Yeah, and that was a factor, no question. Yeah. But even the people that were in the government, as I look back at it, they had cushy jobs. They were corrupt as hell, and they weren't interested in the Afghan people. They just weren't. But your point that Taliban controlled, even back in the time when we were there in 2009 and 10, they controlled a lot. Americans would come in and have a military exercise and clean them out. And then as soon as they left, the Taliban came back.
Mhm.
That was typical, even back in 2009 and 10.
Yeah, and you know, Paul, one of the things that I have just recently read a number of things about Afghanistan from sources that I feel are pretty reliable. You know, it's always hard to know, no matter what you read. I mean, you know, the reporting is, I think, typically full of biases, but also the fact that the Taliban, as long as they could control a lot of that rural property or the rural area, they actually were making tremendous money off of the sale of opium, in spite of the fact that they insist that people who in their religious groups absolutely were not to use drugs. So
well, I have to give another story. They raised a fair amount of grapes in Afghanistan, and I'll never forget. I was out with this. We all generally had an interpreter with us, and this fellow was there, and he said he had beautiful grapes, and I said, "Well, where's the winery? Where's the place where you make it into wine? Can you show it to us?" So he said, "Oh, Dr. O'Connell, our religion doesn't allow us to drink wine." And as we were leaving with the interpreter, he said, "Well, you see right over there, that's where they make the wine." So anyway, it's you know, a lot of mixed messaging.
You mentioned before that when the foreigners left Afghanistan, there was a huge out-migration. I think you said it went half the population left. Is your expectation now that a similar event is going to happen?
When the Americans took back over in NATO and so forth, like I said, most of them came back, and the population now is double what it was in 2000.
Yes.
And I don't think that'll be the case this time. You know, they're going to have to learn to live with the Taliban, because Iran and Pakistan won't allow it to happen.
So it's a different world for the people that are now there.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's what traveling around there, it was really like you were on a different planet. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
What was the reason for the Russian invasion in the 70s?
I'm trying to remember. Well, they were that was, as I remember, that was under the Soviet Union, and they wanted to control every aspect around their empire. And I just don't remember that, but it was just a matter of them having control of that area. And in fact, they had a prime minister there that was basically answer to Moscow. And I think they had some difficulty, and so they just sent their troops in and took it over.
So that wasn't, the supposed reason that we went in was to get rid of the terror from the ISIS and stuff. So I guess it wasn't that far different for the Soviets.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, it. Well, as anybody that read any history of that part of the world, you know, going all the way back to Alexander the Great, none of them survived there. You know, eventually they left. You know, because they just, it was such a different culture and a different way of looking at things that they got pushed out. Yeah, it's an unbelievable history.
If you take Afghanistan and then you go north, I believe to Kazakhstan or
yeah, there's 3 stands up there.
Are those countries doing any better in the sense of adopting what I call reforms that lead to better productivity and
I think they are doing somewhat better because they haven't had the history of civil strife that Afghanistan has had, but they are Muslim countries.
Yes, yeah,
they're Islamic.
It's another
but
reason
they haven't had the history of Afghanistan.
But they would still have the religious issue
Yes.
as far as the role of women and other things.
I'm sure that they are not near as productive as they could be, because you know, when decisions are made so far as economic development are concerned, in a strongly Islamic country, the religious beliefs will be first before economic efficiency. It's just that's just the way they are. And so religious beliefs, if it contests with any kind of economic efficiency decisions, that's the direction they'll go. And so that's why, in general, throughout the Middle East, they're economically not really productive countries. They're not. You know, they don't have, they just don't have, their people just don't have much to hope for.
So what aspect, if you attribute it to their faith, the Islamic faith, whether it's Sunni or Shia, that they're unproductive, what would you change? I mean,
well, I'm just saying their religious beliefs become much more important than economic development. Whenever a decision is made, their religious beliefs will come out on top. And that's just the way it is. And I've been in Iraq, in Jordan. Now Jordan's a little better, but you can, when you're in those countries, they pray 5 times a day. In the morning when I was in Kabul, the thing went off, ready for prayer. It's just that a better lifestyle is not as important as religious beliefs. It's just a fact. Yeah.
Paul?
Yeah.
Was somebody else trying to?
No.
I wanted to ask you something that struck me about what you said was that in China, there was this will, this concern to raise up everybody, to improve life for people in general, to think about the common good. And you said that simply wasn't an interest or concern of the Afghanistan government.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you, in all your experiences and working with USAID, the World Bank and so forth, can you see a pattern in terms of the countries where work and projects have been done, or advocacy for these kinds of projects, where if the government itself tends to have this concern for the common good, that these things can go forward and be productive. And if they don't, then there is no way that you can really implement such improvements.
If I look at Islamic countries that I've been in, and just in general, not one of them are really concerned about the well-being of just the nature. You've got to remember, China is not a, and it was only 20 years ago that they all of a sudden decided they have to have a mixture of capitalism and government-run industries in order to be successful. So they changed. They developed it's not perfect, but they recognize that they have to have individuals, at least some incentive for individuals. Otherwise, and they don't have a religious belief, believe me. China doesn't. And so they just figured out that, well, we need a different, rather than just total communist control, they decided on a mixture. And they've become very successful, so far economically.
Yeah. You said that this kind of project did not work well in the Philippines. So in that country, what would your analysis include?
Oh, it was corruption, total corruption. Believe me. Yeah. You can in China, and I don't know why it's the case, but they don't have near as much corruption as they do in some of these other countries. In other words, they recognize they better take care of the people in some respects, or otherwise there'll be a revolution again.
So in that regard, with regard to China, you mentioned that corruption. I presume you're measuring that as if the ruling elite, for lack of a better word here, takes a disproportionate share. Income inequality is different there. But in China, I don't know, is it tacitly a bad thing if the leader drives around in a Rolls Royce or something? Or
that's true. Yeah. But also the leaders recognize that if they don't, in China, and they have been very successful in improving the lifestyle of people in China compared to what it was under the Mao rule of total communism. I mean, just saying, all you got to do is look at the pictures of Shanghai and Beijing. The modern communities, modern cities, they have better mass transit than we do by far, and so forth and so on. It's not that it's perfect, but their people are economically a hell of a lot better off than they were 24, 30 years ago.
I think Jack Welch was trying to ask a question, maybe. No?
Hello,
Oh.
Jack? Yeah. So anyone else? So it's go ahead.
I think it's very disheartening what this whole situation, but what is your living accommodations like when you go on a trip like this? Do they have a nice place to put you? You don't have any contact?
Well, when we were there, we lived in I call it a compound, but it was a huge house. And there was about 15, 20 of us in that house. And then we got some more people. We just rented another house. And we had pretty good accommodations. You got to remember, we had all the U.S. aid money behind us. And so we didn't have any lack of resources, quite frankly. And we, now I got a little tired of the Afghanistan food, but they had good fruits there and so forth. And quite frankly, our cook wasn't the greatest in the world, but it was all right.
Was Marion with you?
Oh, no. Well, no. Believe me. In fact, it was interesting. the guy that was in charge of it, he said, well, we're desperate for people to come over and be assistants and that sort of thing. Would your wife be interested in coming over? She said, Paul, are you crazy? and in fact, we had when I did this, took this assignment on, I had to put screen doors on the house to make sure that she felt safe in the house. The house we have here. So, yeah.
Paul, do you have a feeling whether the World Bank has a similar opinion about the difficulty of working with Muslim nations?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We had many discussions about this. And, oh, yeah. Yeah. For the reason I indicated. The religious beliefs are more important than economic development. It's just bottom line, issues. That's why I get so concerned in our country, where religion becomes more important than the well-being of the average person.
Right.
It's just, oh yeah, no, they're very aware.
So in this, Dave Rice again. So considering your feeling about the effect of like a religious tradition on likelihood of improving societal health or well-being, does USAID now look with that as a factor in their evaluation of where they would invest money?
Well, I think more so now, when we went into Afghanistan, the reason we did was because of 9/11.
Yeah.
And, but then we wanted to develop the country so that it would be a modern economy. And we tried that for 20 years and it didn't work.
Yeah.
And the reason it didn't work, like I said, religious beliefs and their culture and our culture just never meshed. Never meshed.
Never will.
And the Western culture just doesn't. And this is a long history. It's not just our experience in Afghanistan. This goes back several years. It goes back to the Crusades. All this, for 1,000 years or more. We've tried to interact with the Islam countries, and it just hasn't worked.
Is that true in Indonesia as well, Paul?
Not Indonesia. No, that's somewhat different. They're much more moderate so far as Islamic belief is concerned. And but they still have a problem in regard to religion being more important than economic development.
So the trillions that our country spent investing in the Vietnam and the Afghan war, it really seems like it was an absolute waste. And I've heard Jim Peach say that we have the money that we need to actually lift people out of poverty in our country, to
we do
deal with this increasingly huge gap between the wealthy and the poor. But he usually ends that statement with, "It just depends on how you choose to spend it." And I have to wonder, if we had, could we have ever, could people ever persuade Congress to invest in our people the way they invested in that war?
Well, it's not just a war. We spent billions of dollars in development, and I hope, and there has been improvement. There's no question. So far as irrigation systems and land management and that sort of thing, I just hope it continues under the Taliban. I don't know if it will. I have no idea. It's just like the treatment of women. We made a major effort to change that, and it looks like it's going backwards. you know, and so I just hope that that will continue. But if they want to join the world, they're going to have to do better than they have, I think. I mean, I'm talking about the Taliban now.
Right, right. And
But it's a totally male-dominated religion.
the Russians actually made some huge strides too. I mean, getting women educated and you know, when you read the book, the last book on your list.
Oh yeah, I know which one you mean. I can't remember the name right now.
It's by the same author as The Kite Runner. It's something about the rising sun.
Right.
You know, the life that was chronicled in that book of a woman and how things improved so dramatically, were so wonderful for her during the reign of the Russians. And that when the Taliban rushed back in, it was all gone, like overnight. So I would assume, do you think that the same thing, exact same thing will happen?
I think hopefully it won't go back as far, but you know, these guys, they're now back in power. So why should they pay attention to anybody else? You know, and they've figured out how to survive. And so
is there any possibility, do you think, that the people themselves would revolt after having some improved conditions?
Yeah, and I think that it's like any authoritative system. They've got to keep their populace somewhat happy, or otherwise they'll revolt. So they may be more moderate than they have been in the past. You know, I hope so. Yeah. So
you'd mentioned the in early part of your talk about the choice between the lesser of two evils, and the choice was between the Taliban and a U.S. occupation. I took that to be your words.
Yeah.
Do you think that vote? I mean, there's a choice, but you think that if it was made by the women, that would be the same vote?
No. No. But you got to understand, it's totally controlled. That government and that country is totally controlled by males.
Yeah.
But they just don't have much. You got to understand, a large part of Afghanistan is still rural, uneducated rural people, and they don't know any better. They've never had especially women. Now over the last 20 years, they've had some education and stuff, and so they're trying to exert their will. But still, a large percentage of that country, including the women, are uneducated and living in rural areas. So they have no ability to exercise any authority or power. It's just the way it is. And they want to keep them that way. Unfortunately, that's just true.
Do you have any idea throughout the history of the occupation of both Russia and the US, was there any time when the control of the Taliban of most of that rural area was not strong? It was
always strong.
They were always there. They were always there.
They were always there. They just, when the US military went out on their excursions and fought the Taliban in different ways, they just disappeared back into the rural communities. And then when the Americans left, they came out and controlled it again. And by the way, the US supported government in Kabul never really had the interest of the average. They were doing well. They were totally corrupt. And as soon as many of them they moved to different Islam countries, when they got pulled out, they took their money with them and left. They just left.
Wow.
Just like the the head of the government. In fact, he used to be an employee of the World Bank, the current head, I forgot his name. And you saw what he did, boom, he just left.
Wow.
And believe me, him and his family have as much money as they need to survive.
Are you speaking of Karzai now?
No, not Karzai.
You're speaking of the most recent.
The most recent one.
Yeah, right.
I think Karzai is still there.
Mhm.
I believe it. I believe he is. But the one that was the most recent one, I
Yeah.
forgot his name.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we know who you mean.
Yeah, and I had an office mate, and he was similar age as I was when I was there. And we had long discussions, you know. And what he was looking forward to, he remembers he was back when they had a kingdom and had a king and queen and that sort of thing. And that was the time he wanted to go back to.
Ah,
That he wanted to go back to, and where they totally controlled, you know, but that's disappeared.
mhm.
So anyway, no, it was quite an experience.
Wow.
Well, anyway, we're past our time.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for your attention.
Thank you, Paul.
Really interesting.
And
Extremely much.
Charlie, what's next week?
Speaking of the common good, this is a Commonwealth Club of California interview of Robert
Oh,
Reich.
yeah, I think I might have remembered that. Yeah. Well, anyway, that should be an interesting program.
Yeah,
Well, he's an interesting speaker and he's got a great topic. So I
Yeah.
hope we get a chance to hear that next week.
Good. All
Thank
right.
you.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Looking forward
you.
to it.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Of course, happy to help.
Well, I'm of the age where I need help on the computer.
Well, it is wonderful to have somebody getting our technology working well.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great one.
Hi,
everyone.
Annette.
Bye.
All right.